you can see why the government wanted them covered up.
What evidence is there that the mob killed JFK?
Otherwise, the hit would have occurred in Chicago.
They're reading his mail a whole year before the assassination.
Exactly. They don't send out press releases from the outfit.
Welcome to The Takeaway. I'm Alex Maragos. In every episode, we're trying to have approachable conversations with expert journalists about the biggest stories in Chicago and beyond. And we always go for three things: what we know, how we know it, and why it matters to you. Today, the story is one of the biggest stories in American history, the 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And specifically, we're looking at a new batch of documents just released by the Trump administration. And our guest today has covered the assassination, the mob, and where those two intersect for decades. Chuck Goudie is here. Chuck, welcome to The Takeaway. Nice to have you.
Thank you. Just to correct the record, I didn't actually cover the assassination at the time.
Well, the search for answers.
Covered it since.
Thank you. Yes, I appreciate the correction.
I'm old, but not that.
Well, this has been a matter of a personal interest and personal fascination as well as professional. Let's start with the latest batch of documents that just came out. What's in it that we didn't know previously?
Most of the documents had been previously released, but they were all blacked out.
Okay.
And thousands of pages that came out over the years were redacted, to use the legal term for it. And so it actually created this air of mystery. Well, what's the government trying to cover up and hide here?
Yeah.
And so when these were released side by side, you could see what it was they were covering up. And the majority of these documents, except for the people who have really followed this closely over the years, are pretty boring.
Mm-hmm.
These are CIA questions, internal operations of the spycraft business, kind of interesting reading, but also pretty tedious and detail-oriented.
I think a lot of people, when they first heard that documents were to be released, President Trump promising to, I think, release everything, they were expecting a bombshell. Some people were expecting a bombshell or certainly new details, but there wasn't anything that greatly changed the trajectory of most people's thinking, right?
No, and in fact, when I reported on this the very day that these were released, at the end of my report, I said the essential facts remain the same, that it certainly appears, and there's no evidence to the contrary, that it was one man, Lee Harvey Oswald, one shooter that day, and no conspiracy. And nothing in these documents changes those essential facts.
When the government does release records that are redacted, it almost leads us to be more interested than we were before the documents were released, because it's that thing, what are they hiding?
It sure does.
What do you think we were able to learn about at least the CIA and some of that spycraft and tradecraft, which some would argue, well, this latest release would just be more embarrassing just for how the investigative work was done or how the spycraft was done versus anything that materially changes what we know about the assassination?
Right. It did confirm, these latest documents did confirm that the CIA and the U.S. government not only knew of Lee Harvey Oswald months, if not years, before JFK was assassinated, but that they were tracking him as best they could in the early 1960s. They knew, for instance, that he defected for a time to the Soviet Union and then came back, and that he was in Mexico and he visited the Cuban consulate and the Russian embassy in Mexico City. They knew all these things about him. They monitored threats that he made. They had photos of him with rifles and had conversations quoted by witnesses saying that he was going to kill Kennedy. So he was not just on their radar, he was central on their radar for a very long time.
They were reading his mail a whole year before the assassination happened. Over the years, I want to ask, what are the Chicago connections that have come into play? Of course, the president was assassinated in Dallas, but in such a wide-ranging net, you're going to have places like Chicago caught up in that.
In the latest documents, there are some Illinois residents who there's a lot of detail about how they were recruited by the CIA and basically dropped into Havana to be spies in the early 1960s. These are people who, for whatever reason, were identified by the government as people who would make good spies. So there's a little bit of that. There are people who are referred to in some of the latest batch of documents as being from Chicago or from Illinois, but not playing a very big part. I mean, the essential big Chicago items are Lee Harvey Oswald bought his rifle from a sporting goods store in Chicago and got it by mail. Back then, there was obviously no internet sales.
Right.
You did it in mail order. Jack Ruby, who killed Lee Harvey Oswald, was from Chicago and was thought at the time, at least, to have some role with the Chicago mob, although that's still debated, 75 years later. The big overarching Chicago connection to the threats against JFK would be the Chicago outfit. They didn't like what was happening with the Kennedy administration and Cuba. They definitely didn't like Bobby Kennedy, JFK's brother, who was the Attorney General at the time, because he put a target on organized crime in America and was really costing them money. So those were the kinds of things that have played out in all the JFK documents that have been released over the years, totaling about 6 million pages.
Mm-hmm. And 99%, I believe, now is open to the public and unredacted,
Right.
I believe.
There will still be some that are going to trickle out. The President Trump promised 80,000 pages this time. We were at like 65,000, I think. So there will be some additional pages. Nobody thinks that there's going to be any change in the conclusions.
Over the years of you covering the document releases and the search for answers, and also covering the mob here in Chicago, how has the story or the theory that the mob did it or the mob had a hand in it, how has that theory changed over time? Or has it changed?
Well, it has changed because the document releases previous to this one over the years have contained some details about organized crime plots against JFK. I've reported over the years that there were at least 6 or 7 different actually actionable death plots against JFK, including 2 in Chicago in early November of 1963 that never happened. One of them was supposed to happen when his motorcade was coming from O'Hare in early November, where he was going to attend a college football game at Soldier Field. The authorities, Secret Service, found a rifle cache in a motel along the way and a detailed map plotting JFK's travels that day. And the Secret Service managed to turn JFK around the morning of that football game, and he never came here. Otherwise, the hit would have occurred in Chicago, many people think. And there were a number of plots not connected to each other, not part of a conspiracy, different viewpoints, different organizations, different assassins who wanted JFK dead for different reasons. It just so happened that it ended up in Dallas.
The one that would have been for the Chicago football game, was anybody arrested for that? And how long after did we know that was a plot?
Well, the White House attempted to give an alternate story as
For
to
why
JFK didn't come.
Yeah.
There was a war happening in Vietnam at that time, and they used that as his out, that he needed to attend to some Vietnam development in the White House. But it kind of trickled out. The information did the real reason behind it over the years.
Okay.
And there are documents that show that the real reason was because there was this organized plot, and the outfit always had some level of deniability in these to try to distance themselves from the actual plot. The bosses certainly didn't want to get arrested for that, and so they did distance themselves from the actual plot. But it has come out, and most investigators believe that organized crime didn't want JFK to continue. Mm-hmm. They certainly didn't want Bobby Kennedy as the Attorney General, largely because of what was happening in Cuba at the time. It cost the Chicago outfit hundreds of millions of dollars in lost gambling revenue because Fidel Castro came in and shut them down.
Wow, I never heard of that Chicago football game plot and how close it really was to happening, or potentially happening. Why have you taken such a focus to covering the mob, and what draws you to this story? And then what also draws you to continue to cover the search for answers in the JFK case?
When I was a high school radio reporter in suburban Detroit, the one of the stories that I covered back then was something to do with the Detroit family of the mafia. And so I took an interest in it back then. I took an interest in the Jimmy Hoffa disappearance, and I've kind of just followed it over the years. When I came to Chicago, the outfit had a much stronger hold on the city than it does today. And when I was working at ABC7, there was nobody there who was interested enough to cover it. And so I just kind of took over the beat as my own and ran with it. And so I've continued to work it and follow the players and try to figure who's in charge and who isn't. It's one of those stories, they don't send out press releases from the outfit.
No, they're not a good PR operation there. Really quick, just speaking about the mob, for people who are in Chicago today or just growing up in Chicago right now, how would you describe the Chicago then to now? Because we don't think of Chicago as being a mafia operation, a mob operation, because of the downfall of those families.
Right.
But can you paint the picture for what it was like back then?
Well, the real difference between then in 50s, 60s, even 70s into the 80s and now is that there's no trail of bodies. You don't have a weekly occurrence of somebody at O'Hare being found in a car trunk dead at the hands of organized crime. The mob has pretty much given that up as bad for business. And so they're going about their business much more discreetly. They're into the same rackets, albeit maybe on a smaller scale. There aren't nearly as many bosses or street soldiers as there once were. But they're still active. They still have the same rackets and hustles, labor racketeering, loan sharking, prostitution, drugs, even though to this day they claim they're not involved in illegal drugs. So that's the big change, is the trail of bodies that disappeared. But make no mistake about it, they're still corrupting or trying to corrupt law enforcement, judges, prosecutors. They would love to be able to continue to throw cases as they did in the 60s and 70s.
And get that edge.
Absolutely.
Based on everything we know today, what role did or didn't the mob have in getting JFK elected in 1960?
Well, if you took a poll of people on the street, you'd probably have 9 or more out of 10 saying the mob was responsible for getting him elected, finding votes in the so-called river wards that don't exist, and coming up with an extra 10 or 15,000 votes from the city of Chicago to get him elected. There is no evidence that Illinois voting was thrown by the outfit or anybody else to get JFK elected. There's no evidence of widespread vote fraud the year that JFK was elected president. Nobody was ever charged or even arrested in connection with a vote fraud scheme.
Bringing it back to JFK here, with the latest releases, not just the one a week ago, what do you still want to know that you don't know? And people will have their own theories, and there's a whole industry related to that. But is there anything that you think would serve the public to know that we don't currently know about what happened?
Right. I mean, I'm satisfied and have been for a long time with the official, the Warren Commission and the official investigative conclusions of what happened to Kennedy. There will always be questions about the magic bullet and the grassy knoll and whether there was an additional shooter. But when you look at the totality of things, the conspiracy theorists very likely have gotten a lot of it wrong. And the simple plot that existed at that time and the way that Lee Harvey Oswald carried it out seems to me to be the way that it happened. There are people who disagree with that, obviously, and we hear from them all the time after we air reports on this. If there's one thing that I'm still interested in, there was a little reference to it in these latest documents.
Right.
I've reported on it over the years, and that is that there were Cuban refugees and militia trained in Cook County back prior to Kennedy's assassination by the outfit. They brought several hundred people from Cuba. They corrupted some law enforcement officers here to train these people to go back to Cuba and stop Fidel Castro from taking over. because they didn't want to give up their gambling revenue mostly from Havana.
Do we know where in Cook County this happened?
There was a warehouse on the west side.
Wow.
That was well known to certain people in law enforcement. And there was a high-ranking Cook County sheriff's deputy who eventually went to federal prison for unrelated things. A guy named Richard Kane. There are books written about him.
Okay.
And he was involved in this project to train these Cuban militia to go back to Havana and essentially stop Fidel Castro.
Wow.
It's an interesting, little-told story.
Yeah.
And I've reported on it a few times over the years. There's been reference to it in some of the previous document dumps from the Kennedy file. And it's one of those kind of second-tier stories about JFK you don't hear a lot about.
I guess so, but it has just three fascinating elements of the mob colluding with Cook County sheriffs who are colluding with the CIA.
Right.
Just all three of those things coming together for the same purposes.
Yep. Exactly. And it obviously didn't work.
Right. No, it did not work. Over the years, as you have covered document dump after records release, after whatever you want to call it, what have you made of the intelligence community or different administrations, both Republican and Democrat, saying, yep, it'll come out, we're getting to it. Of course, the Records Act, President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992, all documents related to the assassination were supposed to be released by 2017. And still, yes, very many are, but we're not at 100%. What have you made of the slow release that's come over the years?
You know, now that we have the unredacted versions of these records that had been covered up over the years, you can see why the government wanted them covered up. It wasn't to contain a deep, dark secret as much as it was to contain personal information about people who were doing really sensitive work on behalf of this country, people who were doing spy work in foreign countries. If their names, their family members' names,
their Social Security
addresses, their Social Security numbers in some cases, if those had been released in real time or close to it, they would have been in grave jeopardy. I'm not so sure that some of them still aren't because of this latest release. They have family members. Some of them are still alive. Certainly the Social Security numbers are a problem for even a former attorney in Washington, D.C. who worked on Trump's case in 2016. His Social Security number was in there from the 60s when he was just starting out as a lawyer. So he's not happy about that.
No. I just want to throw out some myths that have been out there, and I want you to tell me what evidence there is to support those theories.
Okay.
Let's start with what evidence is there that the mob killed JFK?
There's no evidence at all that the mob killed him in Dallas that day or that Lee Harvey Oswald was working on behalf of the Chicago mob. There were mob plots against JFK, and the likelihood that there were also plots by organized crime against his brother, the Attorney General Bobby Kennedy. But there's no connection between the mob and what actually ended up killing JFK.
What evidence is there the CIA killed JFK?
There's no evidence that any CIA operative killed him, CIA agent, or that there was a price tag on JFK's head by the CIA. You could read between the lines of a lot of things, especially in this latest release, and the fact that they were tracking Lee Harvey Oswald so closely, but nobody's ever made the leap, and it would be a huge jump to say the CIA did it.
What evidence is there that there was a second shooter?
Well, there's a lot of evidence in people's minds that there was a second shooter, that somebody was on the grassy knoll, but no law enforcement agency has definitively come out and said there was a shooter other than Lee Harvey Oswald, that there was somebody else that we couldn't find, don't know who the person was, connected to the motorcade route that day in Dallas.
And one more. Any evidence that Lyndon Johnson knew of or was complicit in the assassination?
Nothing that I've read in any JFK file would indicate that Johnson knew anything about this before it happened, no. That's an easy story to concoct, and there are certainly people who have put that out there over the years. But nothing in the JFK records, to my knowledge, would indicate that the authorities believe that to be true.
What do you think? Do you think these releases will do anything to quell the concerns and the theories that are still out there, or are you of the mind that people are going to believe what they're going to believe.
They still think that there's a cover-up. I mean, some people do, and there may still be some things that are being withheld, that you really don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that all the questions will ever be answered to everyone's satisfaction when it comes to JFK.
Yeah. So this has been a fascinating conversation, just learning, of course, how many Chicago connections and different touch points there were. As you sit here from the latest release and of all the releases prior, what's your one takeaway from covering this for as long as you have?
That it will never end, I mean, is the first thing, mainly because there's generational fascination with President John F. Kennedy. People who weren't even alive at the time, too young to remember it, people who are currently teenagers who know about it only from the history books or the movies have this fascination with the last U.S. president to be assassinated, pretty much in our lifetimes. And the fact that there are still questions about it. You would think that in this country there wouldn't be questions about anything that was so severe, so important as the assassination of a U.S. president.
Chuck, I really enjoyed the conversation.
That was great.
Spending some time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for watching The Takeaway. If you liked this video, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode.